The following is distributed by the Berean Call.
Chapter 7, A New Beginning. The first thing I saw when I opened my eyes in the morning was the horse, standing by the cart and chewing great mouthfuls of grass. "Hurry, get up, Maria," my mother was saying. "We must leave before it gets too light." I needed no second reminder. Memories of yesterday were too vivid to make me want to linger there, and we were soon on our way. Unhindered and unnoticed, we went. Even the occasional army vehicle which passed us hurried by with never a pause. Surely it must have been obvious that we had nothing to offer in the way of either resistance or help. The days merged into one another as we made our uncertain way westward, remembered only by the bit of food obtained here, the wayside shelter gained there, and at last the day when my tiny baby sister, born in the rickety wooden cart, ceased crying. She was buried, nameless, by the side of the road in a solitary, unmarked grave. My mother sat in the cart with bowed head as the tree which grew over the freshly turned earth receded further and further into the distance. We stopped that noon, and when my mother refused to eat, I climbed up beside her, frightened at her pale quietness. I asked her if she, too, was sad that we hadn't died together in the cellar at Verkhovsk. Here would be as good a place, or back there. Her languid eyes turned in the direction of the tiny grave. My father overheard our conversation and tried to encourage her, but she was so desperately weak. She clutched his hand and begged to be lifted out of the jolting cart to die in peace beside the nearby flowering hedge. "Hush, don't speak of dying. That is only as God wills. Let's pray rather that you get strong again." "But, Father," I broke in, "I'll stay with her, right here." I eyed the pleasant place where we had stopped, thinking that if one must die, it would be as good a place as one could find. Besides, it was unthinkable that my dear mother should be left alone. Now my brother joined Father in begging us not to speak of dying. "You wouldn't leave us, would you, Mother?" Franz pleaded, eyes brimming with tears. I wouldn't fully appreciate the special bond between these two until some years after we had lost him, but his anxiety aroused my mother as nothing else could, and she smiled her gentle smile once more and ate to please us. On the road again, little Alice tried to do her part by running beside me, while I attempted to imitate the long strides of my brother. At least we had sturdy legs and boundless energy. We came at last to Uralsk, a city where for months many other Germans like ourselves had been arriving almost daily. At the invitation of a kindly family, we stayed for a while so my mother could rest. Father mingled continually among the many refugees, most of whom had also been civil prisoners, as we were. His plan was to get nearer to Troitsk, a large railroad center, and there somehow to get transportation. Horses were simply inadequate. Surely the authorities would recognize that we were German citizens, in no way involved in this revolution, and would let us go either to Moscow or Petrograd by train and from there to Germany. This was my father's hope. In August of 1918, we started out in a caravan with many others in the direction of Troitsk. There seemed safety in such large numbers, and for the first time since we had been exiled, we entertained the hope that we were indeed on the road to freedom. Arriving on the outskirts of the city, our ragged crowd of refugees was stopped by soldiers on horseback. Two men stepped forward with my father to address the officers. "We're German citizens and want to get safe passage back to Germany." The soldiers eyed us suspiciously. "German citizens, eh?" said one. "Prisoners of war, more likely. But see here, the important thing now is working class or capitalist. Which are you?" "Well," replied my father hesitantly, "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm really nothing now, though I did have a factory back in—" "So, a factory," said the soldier contemptuously. "Well, it's clear you're no friend of the new Russia." Then turning to two of the soldiers, he said, "Lock these men up. The rest of you, move on." Desperately disappointed and fearful for my father, we prepared to camp. The night was warm, but the ground seemed harder than usual as the hours crept by. Sometime during the night, I became aware of a commotion. There were voices, suppressed exclamations of joy, questions. My father and the others had returned. In the confusion, we managed to understand that at the jail where they'd been locked up, the question of citizenship had arisen again, but hadn't been established satisfactorily. Perhaps to eliminate what might have become a troublesome problem, the police, who my father suspected were really sympathetic to us, had told them to go back to their families and leave town as quickly as possible. If not, they would be in danger of being drafted for labor in the morning. As quietly and unobtrusively as possible, the various families gathered their belongings and broke camp, scattering in different directions, planning how they could again contact each other when a more opportune time might come for leaving Russia. Troitsk had become a fairy tale city in my imagination, the portal to a new home and security and permanence. Now I was leaving it without having set foot in its streets, let alone boarding the train that would bring me and my family back to the land of our ancestors. Disconsolately, our family and a few others traveled a 3 days' journey and arrived at the Cossack town of Mias. Perhaps it would be better to stay where we were until a safer way of escape should become possible. Mias was a big town and a prosperous one, quite different from the log villages I had known in these regions. Wrought iron fences set off the large homes from the broad streets, and the well-dressed children playing within those carefully groomed gardens made me eye my own ragged dress with embarrassment. Boldly, my father began knocking on doors to see if some shelter might be available for his family. When at last a kindly old lady led us around in back of a large, solidly built house, through a garden, and then to a sparsely furnished little shack tucked away among her plants, I knew that I was again at home. Wonderfully enough, the river Mias flowed through this very garden and reminded me of other homes I'd known. Though we had a shelter in this beautiful city, food was another problem. The Red Army had already been through and in a thorough sweep had confiscated all supplies, so our situation was desperate. One could hardly beg from people who themselves had so little. Father knew that food was always more available and the annoying officials less numerous in the small villages. So immediately after getting us settled, he and my brother set off into the countryside with horse and wagon to look for some means of feeding the family. It didn't take long for Father to assess the situation. Salt was scarce in the area. Everywhere along the river, one could see the flat pans set out, with a dirty gray mineral appearing on the bottom as the water evaporated. It had given my father an idea. "We'll go to the salt mines," he'd said. "It's not too far. I'll bring back salt to trade for food." And so he had. That one huge sackful of white grains supplied us with bread for a long time to come. Mias's prosperity had been built on the gold which her sparkling river so generously yielded. How well I remember being taken by Father to visit the mining operations and seeing the slanted screens onto which the sand and water were scooped and shaken and watched for the fabulous nugget which would make yet another man wealthy in one afternoon's work. But those days of free enterprise were soon to be over, of course, and the river would give up its wealth to a new kind of labor force, brought unwillingly from homes and lands far from its banks. Here, too, I saw silkworms for the first time. When one became too old to search for the golden nuggets, one could spin shiny threads into shimmering silk fabrics. Never having gone to school, I was fascinated by every new thing that came my way, and eagerly I used to visit the shacks where the worms fed on the mulberry leaves. I saw the cocoons put in the ovens, where the hard-working little worm inside was killed to prevent its eating its way out through the delicate silk threads, and thus destroying their commercial value. Next, the cocoons were placed in vats of water and beaten with branches to loosen and separate the spun threads. Then skillfully one caught its beginning to roll it onto the drying frame set out in the hot sun. From those wonderful shimmering threads one woman even fashioned exquisite silk stockings, an enterprise almost unheard of in that part of the world. Experiences such as these provided my limited education. Again, the simple logistics of survival forced my father and Franz to go out with the old horse and wagon. This time, neither returned home. We could guess why. The labor raids, which were becoming more frequent now, were terrifying and usually accompanied the foraging sweeps of the Red Army. When trenches needed to be dug, bridges built, roads repaired, both men and women were picked up without warning to return months later to their frantic families. When my father and brother did at last return, it was without the decrepit old cart and equally decrepit horse. Even my mother wasn't exempt from the raids. Never shall I forget the day when, over her tearful protests, she was taken from 4-month-old Gertrude, who had been born in the bare little house by the river. My father and brother had been taken earlier as well, and with no preparation for my heavy responsibility, I was left alone with Alice and the baby. Little Alice and a crying infant. They were mine to care for, and I was terrified. When I remember it now, I scarcely know whether to laugh or to weep. Never had I seen a baby nourished elsewhere than at my mother's breast, and when little Gertrude screamed, I held her to my thin body. Of course the screams continued. In desperation, I placed her on the floor so she wouldn't fall, took Alice by one hand, grabbed a cup in the other, and went among the townspeople to beg. I remembered my mother praying one night that God should take her children because she hadn't any food for us. It had shocked me at the time, and I'd asked her if she didn't love us any more. Now, at this young age, I knew a little of her pain. It was a kind old lady, Mother Ilansu, who showed me how to chew a bit of bread and place it in a rag, making a small nipple just the size for the baby's mouth. Then I must dunk it in some milk and let the baby chew it. Eagerly I followed her instructions, using the milk she gave me. To my joy, the baby responded enthusiastically, and thanks to the pity of others like the Ilansus, Gertrude somehow survived until my father returned. By the time Mother came back, however, after 6 long months of digging trenches, this little one too had died and lay buried in a tiny straw-filled wooden box in the cemetery. Once more, during the time in which we were in Mias, my father and brother were taken, and my mother was left to give birth to a baby in pain and loneliness. That it lived even 8 short days was due to the skill and kindness of a Jewish doctor who sheltered and helped us in our distress. On my father's return, he determined that he must get us to a smaller village. Kundravi was the likeliest place. There he'd found a few Germans, Russian citizens as at home in Urbach, but facing the same problems as we. It would be a sympathetic community, and food would be more plentiful, or so he thought. The better life didn't materialize, however. Kundravi was no more immune to the dread raids than Mias, and my father lived in continual fear of being picked up off the streets. Even food was less available there. Desperately he made surreptitious inquiries, if only some others were willing to risk the long trip west. These considerations scarcely seemed important in face of the tragedy which overtook our family in July of 1920. Along with all other youths of his age, Franz had been required to attend the newly instituted Marxist indoctrination meetings in the village. At the end of the series, these young men were informed that they were now ready to be inducted into the army. It couldn't be true. Surely there was some mistake. Perhaps it was just another labor draft, though that was bad enough. When my father went indignantly to object, the news was stunning. He is 18. He is drafted for army service. That was that. He is a German citizen. This from my father. And in his opinion, that was final. German citizen? Nonsense. He was born here. You were born here. But I am a German citizen. The law when he was born was that he takes the father's citizenship. We have different laws now. Move aside. My father did not move aside. In fact, he made such a commotion that he was carried off to jail, while my brother was allowed to remain free a few more days until he was due to be picked up for induction. When one of the officials came to the house to talk to Franz about his father's unreasonable attitude, The warning was stated plainly. You know what will happen to your father if he gives us any trouble. He stays in jail, or worse, and you get taken away. You're of age. Why should you be allowed to roam around like a parasite? Russia needs her young men. But I'm not a— Silence, bellowed the man, losing his patience. We'll see you on the 20th. In the meantime, tell your father to cooperate or his family doesn't see him anymore. Understand? He turned on his heel and left. With heavy heart, Franz went to the small village prison and talked with Father. It's no use resisting. The rest of you will only suffer for it, and they'll take me anyway. You must try to leave. I'll meet you in Germany later, somehow. When Franz was led away, it was I who followed the small detachment of men out of the town. Father had been released on his promise not to interfere, and he and Mother had said their tearful goodbyes already. Go back, Maria, Franz's lips told me, but his eyes willed me to be there, running along beside him. Little eddies of dust swirled upward from the heavy-booted tread of these young men going so unwillingly to war. He was the youngest, and surely the handsomest, I thought, as I looked up at his sun-bronzed face. How could he be taken from me, my only brother? Goodbye, I sobbed, falling behind. Goodbye, goodbye. We'll meet in heaven, if never again here. Blinded by dust and tears, I stood still at last by the roadside and cried and waved again until I could see him no longer. Father was now more determined than ever to leave. By the fall of 1920, the economy had come to a virtual standstill. 6 years of war had wasted the country, and every phase of agriculture and industry reflected the disastrous government policies which attempted their regulation. The poverty of the working class and its demoralization was seemingly without remedy. Even nature added to the misery with a famine which carried off more than 5 million persons in the Volga region alone. In all, perhaps 25 million of Russia's people died during those 6 dread years of war and its related miseries. Political disturbances kept pace with economic and industrial problems. Even as my brother was being drafted, the first releases were being made, and thereafter thousands of disbanded soldiers were not only pillaging the countryside, but taking up arms against whatever government existed in the place where they found themselves. Early in the year, Cossack had been executed. It was he who had been moving westward across the Urals toward Moscow, and in whose pursuit the Red Armies had burned Verkhovsk. Back he had retreated until finally his forces had disintegrated and he was captured. The long agony of conquest was to continue until the end of 1922, when Vladivostok would at last fall to the Bolsheviks, and all that vast land to the shores of the Pacific Ocean would be under one unified rule. Growing increasingly desperate, my father decided to make another attempt to leave the country, using the terrible confusion existing everywhere as a cover for our escape. Perhaps in Moscow he could find a stable administration which would recognize us as German citizens and let us go. As a result of his inquiries, he learned of a group of Germans who had collected several abandoned boxcars and an old wood-burning engine. With some clandestine repair, they had gotten the equipment into running condition. Here at last was our means of escape. My father gathered us together, and we joined the group. That the transportation system of the country, if one could call it that, was totally chaotic worked to our advantage, as Father had hoped. As circumstances required, the leaders of our group passed themselves off as revolutionaries going to Moscow, as agricultural laborers, or simply as war refugees returning home. Mostly, however, we were only an inconspicuous part of the total framework of misery and confusion to be found everywhere, and we moved not easily or entirely unchallenged toward Moscow. Each boxcar had a small stove for making tea. It also kept out the severe cold to an extent, but in this northern climate, winter came already in September. The wood which we used for both stoves and engine was often wet and green, and we sometimes had to stop for several days to dry out a supply. At these times, the men put their wood-carving skills to use. Each man had a pocket knife, and from chips of wood grew carved buttons and decorative objects, even dolls and dishes. With a nail heated in the stove, my mother burned wonderful landscapes on flat slabs of white pine, as she had done in Nurbach. The local people were eager enough to exchange food for our folk art. It was a time of hunger, of cold, of daily dread that somewhere our tortuous progress would be checked. There were the waits on sidings, the forays for wood and food, the fear of our maddeningly slow engine being overtaken by another train and crushed. What was normally a 10-day trip stretched into 6 long weeks. Arriving in Moscow at last, our train was put under guard. Only my father was allowed, in answer to his urgent appeals, to go to some of the brethren whom he knew at the Baptist church. Immediately they sent a message to the newly installed German ambassador at Petrograd. Back came the wonderful order that we were to pass without delay to that city. In Petrograd, we remained for 2 weeks in quarantine, awaiting arrangements for an exchange with Russian POWs in Germany. By the time we set sail in November, we numbered several thousand homeward-bound Germans, though some, like me, had never seen the land of their citizenship. How excited I was when I saw the waving crowd of people that greeted our ship at Stettin. Obviously, we were some sort of celebrities. There was a band playing just for us. There were the headlines in the papers announcing our arrival. Then there were my uncles, Sasha and Otto, my cousins, how they'd grown. There was the Red Cross, the mobile post office ready with telegrams and writing materials, as well as notices from inquiring relatives. It was all so exciting. Already the burning rooftops of Verkhovsk seemed far away, and the Mongol riders who had accompanied our strange journey into Siberia seemed to be ghostly beings from another world. Here in Stettin no wolves would howl on a winter's night. I was sure of that. Neither were snow tulips likely to be found nearby. It was a greater leap than that, however, that my mind took when I tried to translate what I saw before me into my memory of home. Home meant the soft soprano of my mother's voice at twilight. It was Misha, a clay-bellied stove, Katya, a Christmas tree with 1,000,000 flickering candles. But I knew that these things could never be recreated, and I felt a small sadness amidst the tumult of hugs and kisses. Mother was taken directly to a hospital for general recuperation, while we moved into the vast system of barracks called Hammerstein-Schlachau. Here she joined us eventually. My father was given permission to go directly to Berlin, since he had been almost immediately engaged by the Fettler mission to work among the Russian POWs there. It took special credentials to move into one of the big cities in those post-war days. Also, one had to have a steady job to qualify for an apartment. So while Father worked in Berlin and lived in a rented room, we stayed on at the camp. In 1921, with the slow reorganizing of civil life and the reestablishment of families, our numbers were so reduced at Schlachau that the camp was shut down. Those that remained joined a displaced persons camp in Bavaria, Lechfeld by name, and here my sister Ruth was born in 1922. Of course, we saw my father as often as possible during the 2 years that we were in camp. At those times, we heard of the many Russians among whom my father worked who had accepted Christ. There was no hard regime involved for them, and later some of these converts even elected to stay in Germany to attend a Bible school established for them. At last, in October of 1922, the glad news came that we would be able to join my father in Berlin. He had proved his ability to receive us by having a steady job with a mission and by procuring an apartment. When Father proudly opened the door for us upon our arrival and we looked into the kitchen, we could see at a glance the whole apartment. To us, that one room seemed beautiful. Fondly, we looked at the coal stove, the table, and 2 chairs, the water faucet, ours, all hours. Already my mother's eyes were wandering to the curtainless windows, speculating by what miraculous means she would embellish those bare frames. That night the table and chairs were moved into the hall. When the stove had cooled sufficiently, a blanket was arranged on top for Alice. For my mother and the baby, a cot was rolled in. As for father and me, we slept on the floor. We were at home. From the camp at Lechfeld, I had brought something precious with me to Berlin, something which helped to make the seemingly dismal circumstances brighter. A pastor from Augsburg had come to the camp the previous spring to hold evangelistic meetings. Others had come from time to time to work among the refugees, but this one especially appealed to me. He was so very kind, and when he preached, I felt that he was speaking ever so gently to me. At the invitation, I went forward, weeping, totally convinced that I needed to be saved from my sins. He came to me as I knelt and sobbed my repentance, and after his kindly inquiries and my broken-hearted assurances that I wished to receive Christ, he placed his hand on my head and said, There, little Maria, don't weep any more. Christ receives you." Heaven broke open for me, and I smiled up at him through the glistening teardrops. Shortly after, a baptism took place in the River Lech. From Augsburg and Munich, the Christians came, both Baptist and Lutheran, to encourage our small group. Of course, my father came from Berlin. It was gloriously beautiful, the one sunny day in a week of rainy ones. In my white dress, sent from the Augsburg congregation for the occasion, I stepped to the edge of the water and waited as each of the young people in turn gave their testimonies. I, too, happily told of my conversion and of my desire to live a life true to the one who had died for me. "Will you endeavor to be faithful in witnessing before others, Maria?" the pastor asked me earnestly afterwards. "Oh, yes," I replied, I will. And with all my eager young heart, I meant it.